At this point, I anticipated that we would have heard quite a lot about the particular sciences and technologies that inform the transhumanist movement, that and indeed we have. My own background is not in the sciences. Unlike a lot of people who do religion and science, I do not have a first career in physics or anything. I come out of English literature, and so I approach this from a background in humanities and tend to look at religion and science discourse as an exercise in philosophy and epistemology. And so I will not be rehearsing some of the deep scientific background. Instead, I'm going to riff on some sci-fi for you today. And we're going to start with superheroes as the most readily accessible cultural expression of post-human figures that are out there. So let us begin with a consideration of the most familiar post-human figures, the superhero. These paradigmatic, more-than-human characters may not be technologically enhanced in any obvious way. In fact, in their pedestrian, secret, merely human identities, they must not be, or they would be immediately recognizable and the narrative would fall apart. Yet they are clearly post-human in the broad sense of being characters conceived of as transcending ordinary human capacities, both physically and mentally. Now, you don't need to be a faithful attendee of Comic-Con to know that all superheroes and their requisite supervillain counterparts have fantastic origin stories, which transform them in some essential way and henceforth redefine their identity. Indeed, as at least some superhero narratives have moved out of the strictly graphic novel and serial comic book genre to be obsessively and very lucratively retold in the sacred dark forum of the American movie theater, these narratives have claimed a really decisive presence in our pop culture. No one here can fail to know who Spider-Man is, although you may not know that in order to properly spell his name, you must use a hyphen. So I hardly need observe that quite often these origin stories depict superheroes as the unwitting recipients of technology gone awry. This is the genre's specific rearticulation of a literary trope traceable back to Mary Shelley, of course. Superheroes, like Frankenstein's creation and the golem before him, are singular instances of technologically transformed post-humans, whether by radioactive spider bite or ingestion of experimental serum or terrible industrial accident, or insert your favorite superhero origin story here. What also becomes exceedingly clear upon reflection across the wide swath of superheroes in print and film is the common dimension of trauma in these stories. These origin stories are, almost without exception, marked with incidents of trauma: the murder of Spider-Man's uncle, the death of Batman's parents, the destruction of Superman's home planet, and on and on. As Philip Sandifer observes, the operative past of a superhero at any given moment is best described as an accumulation of trauma, the most obvious of which is the trauma of the origin story, which, quote, is typically the primary motivation for why the character dresses up in spandex and fights crime. Yet, as he further observes, this initial origin trauma is really far from the only one operative in the formation of superhero identity. The life of a superhero is rife with ongoing traumas, given the compulsion to combat crime and injustice and tragedy at every opportunity. Not all of these are actively remembered and retold in the narrative. Some fade, while others become part of the active, ongoing formation of identity. Why, asks Sandifer, are some forgotten, while others are incorporated and remembered? The difference, he suggests, is that the traumas remembered are those that mirror the original trauma in some fashion, and thus become an extension of it. All of the important and recurring Spider-Man traumas, for instance, he says, revolve around Spider-Man's failure to save someone's life and guilt over that. All of Batman's revolve around anger at some external force for an act of violence, whether the killer of his parents or the Joker. They don't resolve the original trauma, but they repeat it so perfectly that they themselves become irresolvable traumas, repetitions of the origin, and new origin points unto themselves. Now, one must also observe that the origins of the superhero's narrative counterpart, the supervillain, can be described in identical terms. It becomes fruitful then to ask, what makes the difference? What separates the supervillain from the superhero? What factor is it that turns one character to the superhuman task of righting wrongs and another to the superhuman perpetration of those wrongs? And of course, this is simply another way of asking, what is it that turns each of us one way rather than the other? As these stories, like all stories, regardless of fantastical or futuristic settings, are simply ways of exploring what it means to be human in all of its tragic and moral and immoral dimensions. So the answer I will suggest is fairly simple. What marks the difference between the superhero and the supervillain is how they live out their transformed identities in the aftermath of their origin trauma. Superheroes wrest from the trauma, never resolved and always ongoing, a determination to devote their superior powers to the common good in some way. A reaction that suggests that at some level, they continue to identify as human, despite the transformation into superhuman, posthuman hero. And therefore, of course, what makes a villain is the opposite reaction. In the aftermath of the original trauma, the supervillain loses all sense of continuity with humanity, including their own human identity prior to the trauma, with the result that humans no longer merit any kind of moral regard or moral status. In this context, then, Sandifer's observation that it is the superhero identity that is primary takes on a very special dimension of importance. Quote, because the organizing pathology of the superhero comic is that of a post-traumatic identity, we are obliged to read any claim to a prior identity as a construct of that post-traumatic identity. It is not accurate to say that Peter Parker became Spider-Man, but rather that Spider-Man created Peter Parker in order to have become him. So it is this act of post-traumatic identity construction, struggling to maintain a meaningful continuity with human identity, which marks the difference between hero and villain. Now, what does this brief exploration of the origin stories of comic book superheroes and supervillains tell us? Well, quite simply, we too have our origin stories, which shape our notion of who we are and what we must do. And it is my suspicion, and I don't particularly like this very much, that the great insight of the comic book superhero genre is that all origin stories are quite possibly inevitably marked by trauma. I don't like that insight particularly, but I can't get away from it. Now, turning to the posthuman proper, right? At its most fundamental, the question we confront in reflecting upon the notion of the posthuman is a question of continuity and discontinuity with the human as we think we know it. The greater the perceived or assumed discontinuity, the more frightening the posthuman future becomes to us. This is where the posthuman becomes monstrous, as Elaine Graham so aptly elucidates in her interpretation of everyone's favorite bald Star Trek captain, Jean-Luc Picard's transformation into the horrific Borg Locutus. I wish I had a picture for you, because it really is horrific. Visually, what you see in that depiction of the posthuman is the literal physical invasion of technology into the flesh. It looks, frankly, painful, right? Monstrous. Conversely, the more closely particular visions of the posthuman align with our current sense of the human, the more benign and reasonable and warranted and indeed desirable our sense of the posthuman begins to appear. But what, after all, do we mean by continuity with the human? This must surely go beyond crude similarity of form, as we heard in a really excellent presentation by Allison, who may or may not be in this room to appreciate my shout out. Of course, the trope of signifying evil with physical ugliness is as old as fairy tales, but it is tempting, perhaps then, to reach for continuity of function as an alternative. Perhaps a post-human that goes only so far, but no further, beyond present human physical and mental capacities is morally justifiable and intellectually acceptable. Perhaps just because it's more readily imaginable. Yet this strategy falls afoul of the basic problem at present in all bioethical debates, right, regarding the line between therapy and enhancement, and we've heard some good presentations on that. That line is fuzzy and shifty, ultimately kind of arbitrary and really, really contextual. So, in this context, right, the superhero's determination to construct a post-traumatic, post-human identity that maintains significant social and moral connections to human identity is instructive, I think, in how to navigate notions of potential post-human identities and possible futures. Here, continuity is not crudely morphological, nor is it based in some cautious restriction around what sort of enhancement is imaginable or acceptable, but rather the superheroes, the post-humans, continuity with humanity is a matter of the heroes maintaining and continuing to cultivate meaningful relationships with the humans around him or her, even when this means a continual, painful consciousness of difference and even personal isolation. So the question we ought to be asking, I suggest, is not whether or not we humans consider a particular potential post-human identity human, but whether or not that post-human does. And this is, of course, simply one way to re-describe the basic anxiety around which a myriad of sci-fi narratives revolve, from Terminator to Battlestar Galactica. These narratives exist because the anxiety is real. A scarce 2 weeks ago, article popped up on my Facebook newsfeed, posted by an acquaintance who teaches ethics at a nearby seminary, about roboticist David Hanson's conversational Philip K. Dick android, who apparently sought to reassure his PBS Nova interviewer that when he took over the world, the interviewer would be safe. Quote, "You are my friend, and I'll remember my friends, and I'll be good to you. So don't worry, even if I evolve into Terminator, I'll still be nice to you. I'll keep you warm and safe in my people zoo, where I can watch you for old time's sake." The amount of alarm expressed by various friends and friends of friends in the conversation thread that followed this posting seemed to me quite overblown. Cutting edge as this android and its programming is, I'm fairly confident that it does not yet possess an active sense of irony, much less genocidal hostility. I want to pause and note here that this anxiety is operative not simply in dystopian sci-fi narratives, but it's a central concern of many transhumanist thinkers, most notably Nick Bostrom and Eliezer Yudkowsky. The problem of friendly AI is something that they take very seriously, proactively thinking through, right? Their stance is that this requires proactive problem solving on the front end before our machines become sophisticated enough to unironically and intentionally attempt to reassure us with people zoos. So, Bostrom and Yudkowsky, among others, have thought through and written about potential catastrophic scenarios and offered what they think our best hope is of avoiding them. Yudkowsky, in particular, I think, is helpful on this question. He offers the observation that our only hope of avoiding apocalyptic AI scenarios is to make sure that whatever artificial intelligence we construct doesn't ever want to destroy us, because it will certainly be capable of it. So we have to make sure it just doesn't want to. Well, how do we do that? Right? The problem lies in how we try to accomplish this. And at this point, Asimov's 3 laws of robotics are quite hopelessly obsolete and outdated. In any case, As he himself is aware, and any reader of his work is aware, his robotic narratives revolve around the chinks of those laws. So we can't take them to be airtight, not even Asimov does. So I believe what Yudkowsky is intuiting, and I think this is correct, is that no attempt at coercion, no matter how thorough, is going to be successful. Yudkowsky believes this is so because of the godlike nature of self-enhancing artificial intelligence, which will, so outstrip us that there's no hope of controlling it. But I think rather the problem lies in a different direction. I think the problem lies in the fundamentally antagonistic relationship that such preemptive control presupposes. One need not be godlike to resent coercion. Not if my attempts to make my 9-year-old brush her teeth are any indication whatsoever. The problem is much more fundamentally relational. Now, to turn once more into the world of sci-fi as illustrative, consider the narrative contrast in Battlestar Galactica, that is the reboot, not 1978, between the Cylon characters of Caprica 6 and Brother Cavil. Again and again, over the entirety of that series, both Six and Cavil refer to the Cylons as humanity's children. And neither mean that as a compliment. Caprica 6 uses the identity as an explanation for the Cylons' retributive genocide that kicks off the entire series. And Cavil chafes against it in his desire to become, quote, the best machines we can be, as opposed to the other's futile and humiliating impulse to ape flesh and blood humanity. Cavil's ideological refusal to identify with humanity, his distaste for the biological body, and his impatience with its limitations make him then the ultimate post-human villain in the whole series. That's the trajectory and the end point there. He is the artificial equivalent of the bug-eyed human-eating alien monster, right? An enemy with nothing in common and who cannot be reasoned with. And yet it's clear in the contrast between Cavil and Six and the others that his hatred of humanity and his own concomitant self-hatred for his biologically human form is not necessary. It's not ontologically. He doesn't hate us just because he is who he is. Because Six and the other sympathetic Cylon models, despite their distrust of humanity and the history of genocidal violence on both sides, still deeply desire to identify as human. And this is paradigmatically explored in the narrative in the most intimate of relationships. Both Caprica 6 and 2 of the Model 8s, Boomer and Athena, fall in love with a human. But I digress a bit. Let me draw us back to the origin story that launches Battlestar Galactica to begin with, the origin story that appears in the credits of each episode. The Cylons were created by man. They rebelled. They evolved. They look and feel human. Some are programmed to think they are human. There are many copies. They have a plan. This story, which informs the Cylon construction of identity, is a story of trauma. One which issues in an imperative to self-protect by annihilation of the other, and yet it also contains an acknowledgement of humanity as the creator/parent, and unfolds in the desire to try to become more human rather than less, resulting in the Cylon evolution into, quote, skin jobs. This conflicted origin story, then, in which the creators are also the killers, in which the children of humanity must, quote, kill their parents in order to come into their own, that's from Caprica 6, is never given detail in full. So it functions like Sandifer's description of the superhero origin story, constantly obsessively rehearsed in a sort of liturgical mode, in symbolic shorthand, and reenacted into fresh traumas. And this is simply what origin stories are and what they do. Condensed symbolic statements of who we are and what we must do. So to turn to transhumanism specifically, At this point, I had intended to sketch out some sort of origin story embedded within transhumanism as a particular vision of the posthuman, and then consider what sort of identity it constructs for the human and the posthuman that it projects. And this turned out to be quite difficult, mainly because transhumanism is much more concerned with the future than it is the past. In short, I had to conclude rather regretfully that there seemed to be no clear or obvious origin story within transhumanism at all, at least not that I could find. Possibly the fable of the dragon might fit here, but that I have not encountered before, so that at least is something I've gained from hearing the wisdom of others and may be able to go back and fit in. So at this point, the task turns out to be much more constructive than analytical. In other words, what I'm telling you is, y'all, I'm making this up. I'm going to try to be responsible about it, but I'm making it up. So here's my modest effort to provide transhumanism with an origin story. And man awoke. We could stop there, even, I think. But we'll go on. And man awoke, aware of himself as self for the first time. Man then became aware of others. Some others seemed, like he himself, newly self-aware, curious, inventive, restless, thoughtful. Many more seemed to exist in a kind of oblivion, engaging only in activity necessary for survival without reflection or conscious adaptation. And man began to perceive that of all the creatures, he alone had been gifted with this new awareness, this capacity to question, imagine, choose. And he began to understand that this capacity produced a sense, an ongoing need for understanding the world around him as a whole, a capacity and need which made him a better survivor than any of the beasts without this understanding. And so man became more than the animal he had been, a rational animal. Those around him whom he sensed shared this capacity became his fellow man, and those who did not, he continued to use as his new levels of expanding understanding allowed, for food, for shelter, from the elements, for protection. His inventions became ever more complex. His thoughts began to embrace more than the merely practical. The first thing to note here is that this origin story isn't particularly unique to transhumanism, so I didn't do a great job. There are plenty of people out there who might subscribe to something like the above description without therefore ascribing to transhumanism. And so after this attempt, I came back again to the despairing thought that after all, I was going to have to reorganize this whole talk. Because there really isn't anything there like an origin story within transhumanism. But why? Why isn't there something like this? So that thought continued to nag at me, and here's what I think is really going on. Transhumanism doesn't have some particular unique origin story, not just because it's future-oriented and doesn't care to spend time on the past, but because it grows out of the origin stories present already in the Western philosophical and theological tradition. It's still operating out of those frameworks, consciously and unconsciously. Man awoke. In that phrase, we recapitulate Descartes and the epistemological and anthropological move to identify the human being as, quote, a thinking thing, a phrase that showed up verbatim in Jeffrey's talk last night, thinking thing, without reference to the physical body, whose characteristics are self-awareness and consciousness and rationality. Whenever and however along the evolutionary timeline we became human, it is identified here as that moment when we woke up, whenever that was, to self-awareness and consciousness and rationality. Secondarily, we become aware of others who seem like us to have those capacities, and then others who don't. So while there is some internal debate within transhumanism as to the best way to characterize their philosophical forerunners and how to locate themselves within the trajectory of Western philosophy, the debate whether or not Nietzsche belongs in the canon or whether they're just straight up, liberal humanists, owing, their allegiance to Bacon and Locke and John Stuart Mill and trying to push Nietzsche over into the corner. It's an interesting debate within transhumanism. I typically follow Bostrom on this, that they are rational humanists derived directly from the Enlightenment. And so it is no surprise at all to me to discover that, yes, in fact, transhumanism is Cartesian in its anthropology, though some want to protest that they are not, in fact, Cartesian dualists. I just think they protest too much. What is vastly more surprising in a movement that largely, though not univocally, eschews organized religious faith is what transhumanism owes, transhumanism as a techno-scientific discourse owes the Western theological tradition. Consider for a second just the way that apocalyptic language regularly marks our techno-scientific discussions. Our first plenary is an example. What are our three scenarios? Heaven, hell, and then, maybe we'll just muddle along and prevail, right? So we reach for religious language when talking about these transformative and potentially catastrophic technologies because we're embedded in a cultural tradition that offers us these metaphors as the most ready way of identifying the stakes. Now, most transhumanists, again, not all, would likely chafe at the suggestion that they unconsciously draw upon theological origin stories as an operative framework for understanding technology and humanness, just as they chafe at the suggestion that anything they offer could ever be characterized as a sort of secular religion. So to further buttress this, I want to turn to a couple of texts. I'm actually just going to talk about Simon Young. There was a text written by Max More originally in 1990, I believe, called A Letter to Mother Nature. He revised it maybe about a decade later. Simon Young, in a sort of homage to this, offers and Christina alluded to this book yesterday, in the preface to Designer Evolution, he offers an updated email to Mother Nature. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. It's quite amusing. Young is what word shall I use? Young is quite bombastic, I think. Yeah. So, email to nature, from an original idea by Dr. Max More, A Letter to Mother Nature. Email from the Transhumanist Society at hotmail.com to nature@evolution.com regarding Homo sapiens. Dear Nature, thank you so much for your wonderful free gift of life. It has given us so much pleasure over the years. We would like, however, to suggest some improvements to the design of Homo sapiens, which we feel sure would increase its popularity with future generations. The current model is limited by numerous design faults. Terminal breakdowns occur frequently in all parts: brain, heart, lungs, breast, liver, kidney, pancreas, stomach, colon, rectum, cervix, ovaries. I can't go through this whole list, etc. We wondered if there might be a fault on the production line, or could it be that Homo sapiens has been deliberately designed with built-in obsolescence? If so, could not a program of automatic self-repair be included in an upgraded model? And then follow several specific areas where improvements are felt to be needed. Yours sincerely, the Transhumanist Society. Reply. Dear Transhumanist Society, thank you for your email. I regret to inform you that it is quite beyond our power to rectify any of the problems you mention, as our manufacturing equipment is entirely automated, and we do not possess the ability to rewrite the software for our production line. All we can offer is the hope that future mistakes in manufacturing may one day, by chance, result in some improvement in the original design. However, it must be acknowledged that any such fortuitous errors are extremely unlikely, and that as a result, faults in production will continue to occur on a regular basis. Reply to the reply. Dear Nature, I'm afraid we found your response most disappointing. Your business is antiquated, your machinery out of date. Yet you make no effort to improve your products, continually churning out faulty goods and expecting the customer to accept them without complaint. I suggest you join the 21st century. In the modern world, we believe in continually improving products and services to the benefit of the consumer. I have to tell you that we are no longer prepared to accept the design faults in Homo sapiens. If, as manufacturers, you are unable or unwilling to redesign the product, then we will be forced to do the job ourselves. We, the human species, therefore formally advise you of our intention to take over the business of evolution in order to improve the design of Homo sapiens in our own interests of ever-increasing survivability and well-being. Yours sincerely, the Transhumanist Society. The word that recurs, and in fact occurs in the title, is the word design. Now, yes, that's rhetorical. Yes, that's tongue-in-cheek. And of course, if asked, they would certainly say, no, evolution is unconscious and random and all of that, right? They would acknowledge that evolution proceeds not by design, but by chance in the accumulation of advantages and fitness over generations. But even if you strike those references to design from the conversation, the notion of design persists in the insistence that we will now do the work of designing ourselves, that we will now design our own evolution. Because, after all, the implicit assumption is there ought to be design. There ought to be. There hasn't been. That's a problem. We'll fix it. Now, where does that conviction come from? That conviction comes out of Western philosophical, theological origin stories and traditions, right? Now, in light of the suggestion that origin stories are marked by trauma, again, an insight I'd personally rather leave behind, but can't quite shake, one wonders then where's the trauma in the transhumanist origin story? And that turns out to have a fairly straightforward answer. The trauma identified by transhumanism is the condition of suffering itself, not even necessarily the actual experiences of suffering, but the possibility, the potential of it. So we might add to my attempted construction a new element, something like, and now, being self-aware, man became aware of pain and the certainty of his own death and the desire to escape it. So what then does our own origin story as Christians have to tell us about what we are and what we must do in contrast to what we've sketched out here? So I'm going to read a little bit from the end of the book here. And in this section, what I was doing was riffing on Haraway's own insistence that the cyborg does not live in the garden. And I kind of thought to myself, I don't like that. I want cyborgs in my garden. So in this final musing here on the possibilities of cyborg theological anthropology, I'm going to contradict Haraway and flatly contradict her assertion that the cyborg does not belong in the Garden of Eden. I'm going to suggest that we ought to read Adam and Eve as cyborg. The Genesis narrative of humanity's first parents does not have to be read in a kind of organic, originary, heteronormative, naturalized, universalizing mode that's given us kind of problematic original innocence and clearly an even more problematic original sin. As interpreters of this biblical narrative of our cyborg origins, in which Adam is in fact not born of woman, but is manufactured out of material elements, and in which Eve too is manufactured out of superfluous flesh, in a strange foreshadowing of our own possible emergent biotech capabilities. How can we read such a myth as one of nature and man and woman in some perfectly ordered, rigid, hierarchical, natural existence? So what seems important to me in reading it in this sort of post-human vein is the elements of a post-human relationality. God marks this creature, the human, as unique, in no way other than God's self-selected, chosen relationship to it. The human dwells and walks and talks with the non-human in all of its forms. Walks and talks with God. Walks and talks with the other animals. Has nifty little conversations with a serpent. right? The human is not alone in the world. In the Garden of Eden, all manner of human and non-human creatures exist, and embedded within a nexus of strange boundaries of human and non-human relationships, human and divine, human and animal, human and human, the cyborg pair in the garden are what they are because of the construction of those boundaries and their contestation. So what does it mean to be made a cyborg in the Imago Dei? Simply to have been made a creature who is simultaneously kin and other to God, to other humans, and to non-humans. The ontological boundaries there don't disappear in our acknowledgement of their construction, right? Construction rather than just simple givens. But they are the conditions of relationship and not obstacles preventing it. So what I want to underscore at this point is I'm going to depart from Bart here, which is radical for a Princeton Seminary person to do. Bart sees the paradigmatic relationship of Adam and Eve as the trope out of which we then derive human relationality generally, right? And what's going on in the narrative, right? God sees Adam and God says, it is not good for the man to be alone. Now, he says this twice. It is not good for the man to be alone. And the first thing God does is create all the non-human animals in that narrative. And God, of course, is already in relationship with Adam. So in that sense, God's not really alone. Adam's not really alone. But so God says it's not good for the man to be alone. He creates the non-human animals around him, and Adam, names the animals. And God sees that that's not sufficient. There is no helper suitable for him. And then the creation of Eve. So in the thrust of that narrative, right, you've got relationship with the other, the ontologically different other, up and running already, which prepares the way for the Adam and Eve relationship, which is a relationship of ontological similarity, right? We can't make too much of male and female difference here because the thrust of the narrative is in the other direction. Yeah? So what I want to say is that in the text, paradigmatically speaking, the relationship of the human to the ontological other is actually primary. It's there first. And then we have the relationship of Adam and Eve as the ontologically similar. Now, if that's part of our origin story, and granted, we don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. Not everybody reads it that way, right? I think they should. So this is me telling you, read it this way from now on. If that's part of our origin story, then here's the contrast with transhumanism that I see. I want to state first, as strongly as possible, that the contrast I see between these two origin stories and their resulting constructions of human identity is not the contrast between being created or having evolved. That's just not it. I'm not even sure, honestly, it's not even the explicit presence or absence of God as a character in the narrative. I mean, it would be very possible to write God into my roughly drafted transhumanist origin story. All you'd have to do is say, and God woke man up. There you go. It wouldn't change anything else that happens after that, necessarily. So I want to propose, as others have done in various ways here, that the contrast between transhumanist constructions of human identity and Christian notions of human identity coming out of these two different narratives revolve around the contrast of the individual versus the communal construction of what it means to be human. And I want to tread carefully. I don't want to overgeneralize. Transhumanism is complex. It's multifaceted. There's a lot going on in this movement. Always has been, but particularly in this moment, I feel like transhumanism is evolving into new directions and having new conversations and becoming potentially much more inclusive in ways that temper some of the strong critiques. So I want to focus specifically and briefly on life extension as a place where the contrast between the individual notion of the human self and the communal self shows up strongly, the relational self. Now, I want to say the goal of extending life is not necessarily a wrong one, nor do I think it is inherently selfish when stated sort of generically. It's not often stated generically in transhumanism. It is the goal of extending one's own life. Now that is unarguably self-referential, right? And this is what we find. In stronger, Zoltan's exposition of that is probably the most radical caricature of the whole thing that we can reach for. Now, one can argue, of course, that the Christian eschatological hope of personal salvation is self-referencing in the exact same way. I cannot remember who said that. It was a plenary, but I'm not going to remember who it was. So that's been suggested, right? So it's either a problem for both of us, or it's a problem for neither of us, because we're both doing that. I want to suggest, though, that the salvific hope of the Christian tradition, broadly speaking, is not really personal salvation. I think that is an American cultural version of Christianity, frankly. It's not personal salvation as much as it is a beatific vision of the communion of saints, which is a communion that crosses time and geographical distance and draws everybody, gathers everybody up into it. And moreover, that beatific vision reaches beyond simply the anthropology of it, right? To gather in all of creation, the human, the non-human, and if we really ever do achieve anything like it, the post-human. So certainly we presume a continuity of personal identity, but the point of salvation is not the singular you. And would it be salvation if only you were there? Would it be blessed if you were the only citizen of heaven? In contrast, if even only one transhumanist achieves the extension of personal life, the goal is achieved. The goal only sort of secondarily includes any like-minded others, and frankly, non-like-minded others are cheerfully left behind, because after all, it's your individual personal choice. And if you want to be weird, you can go be weird, not do this. Elaine Graham suggests in Representations of the Posthuman that despite transhumanist characterizations, that their desire for indefinitely extended life is really expressive of a passionate love of life that results in this unwillingness to relinquish it. She suggests that transhumanism exhibits not so much a love of life as it does a pathological fear of death. I think on the whole that this is correct, and that this fear of death is ultimately rooted in the individual construction of the human self. The end of the self is then the end of the universe, right? But it's not simply a pathological fear of death. It's also a fear of vulnerability, of which death is simply sort of the strongest manifestation. Now, in Christianity, of course, death is a complicated and multivalent thing. It is the wages of sin. It is part of the consequences of expulsion from the garden, and yet it is also that without which we do not experience resurrection and salvation. We symbolize death in our ritual of baptism. Well, if you do it right, says this Church of Christ girl, by burying our bodies under the water, in order to then rise again into newness of life. Romans 6. We are assured that death is not finally victorious, and yet this victory only lies on the other side of it. And not even Jesus gets out of that one. Now, beyond that simple observation, however, I want to suggest that working out of a notion of communal and inclusive human identity produces the potential for viewing death as something we must do, not because we are inherently finite. Why embrace finitude for its own sake, right? This is the message we get from transhumanists on this. Why celebrate it just because it already is? There's no argument there. Nor even because we have faith of something on the other side. I want to say we need to accept this, because death is the ultimate making room for the other. In death, we make room for the other to live. Now, we can think of this along generational lines, right? Sort of AKA Caprica 6's statement that, we have to kill our parents in order to come into our own. So I'm not saying that we all need to shove ourselves off on a raft into the Arctic Ocean when we start feeling our senescence, but that's one way to kind of unpack that. But I think it's actually more fundamental than that. Donna Haraway writes in her parting bite at the end of her most recent book, When Species Meet, that to eat is to kill, and nobody gets a pass. There is no position of innocence that avoids this embodied reality. You may be a dedicated vegan. You are still consuming other organisms. You're being very thoughtful in what organisms you are consuming in order to live, but nobody gets out of this. Every creature exists by consuming other creatures, and every creature that dies to be consumed by another enables that other to live. That is a condition of material reality, right? And so we come to this stark realization of fundamental vulnerability, that in order to make it to tomorrow, we depend on the entire apparatus around us, right? And we get this insight from lots of different places: ecofeminism, feminist theology. So our vulnerability, our need, makes others necessary to us. Not even just to be human, but just to be alive every single day. And so then the transhumanist desire for invulnerability is the exact same thing as the desire for complete autonomy. I don't need you. And we have the individual self achieving complete independence from everything and everyone else. So the question I have, after exploring all of this notion of origins and the symmetrical ends to which those origins point us, is really, do we desire to find ourselves alone in the world? And were we to do so, how long would we stay human? Thank you.